Well, today's gospel question is, do you listen to Jesus when he's telling you a story? And I have a few questions for you before I begin my homily. How many of you have ever listened to a story? Would you raise your hand? Okay. How many of you have ever told a story? Would you raise a hand? Anybody see anybody that didn't raise their hand? Okay. Good. We're going to have a little creativity, sensitivity training if you didn't raise your hand. Anyway, stories are universal and timeless. Stories are told in every time, and they're told in every culture. Every nation has its story. Every family has its own family stories. Each person has his or her own story. And as a therapist, I'm really interested in the stories that people tell me about their lives. I've also found that people remember stories I tell them to make a therapeutic point much better than they listen to lectures I might give. So who doesn't like a good story? Is there a man or a woman or a child in this chapel who's not told and or listened to a bedtime story? Everybody likes a good story. Everybody admires a good storyteller. The Bible that we read from each Sunday Eucharist is the story of our salvation. It's our salvation story. And if there ever was a good storyteller, as we know from reading the Bible, it would have to be Jesus. Now, I thought of this as I read the gospel passage that we just heard about the penitent woman who washed the feet of Jesus with her tears, and the parable that Jesus told Simon the Pharisee about the two debtors, the one who owed 50 days' wages and the one who owed 500, 10 times more. And how Jesus asked Simon which of the two whose debt was forgiven would be the most grateful, the most loving. Now, like most of you, I've heard that and other parables told by Jesus probably hundreds of times. Now, they're so familiar, you just sort of half listen when they're told, because you know the story, you've heard it, and you know how it ends. And I sometimes wonder if that's how we listen to all the stories in the Bible, even the most important ones about the death and resurrection of Jesus. Anyway, something else got my attention as I read this very familiar story and the parable in the story. My thoughts went to process instead of content. And I think I noticed something that's so obvious, I can't believe I missed it all those times that I've read and heard the parables of Jesus. There's a pattern to Jesus' storytelling, and it seems to me that he does it in three parts. Now, part one is the actual event that's occurring. Like in today's gospel story, we have the sinful woman coming to Jesus while he's dining at the house of Simon the Pharisee. And she washes his feet, the feet of Jesus, with her tears and dries them with her hair. Now, witnessing this, Simon wonders if Jesus doesn't know what sort of woman this is that he's allowing to touch him. So that's the first part of the process, the experience. Now, part two is the story, or we call parable, that Jesus tells Simon about the two persons whose debt was forgiven. And Jesus invites Simon into the story by asking him his opinion. Which of the two will be more loving toward the debt holder? And Simon replies, well, I suppose the one whose larger debt was forgiven. And that's the second part of the process. Now, part three is where Jesus connects for Simon the story he has just told with the event, the experience that he has just participated in. Jesus compares the sinful woman with Simon himself, and he asks the rhetorical question. He says, which of you loves me more, the sinful woman who comes to me for mercy, or you yourself, a righteous Pharisee, a holier-than-thou person who did not even extend to me the common courtesies offered to anyone who's a guest in one's home? That's the third part of the process. Now, it seems to me that we all might benefit from being aware of this storytelling process of Jesus. And I say this because I think this process is repeated over and over and over again in each of our lives if we just pay attention to it. I think this process is one of the many ways that Jesus keeps at it, keeps trying to get our attention, no matter how blind we might be and nor how much we might ignore what he's trying to tell us. Now, bear with me just a while I try to explain how I envision this, how I understand it. Part one. God's given us the ability to observe what happens around us through our senses, primarily vision and hearing. And He has given us the intellectual ability to analyze, to process, and to understand what we're experiencing. Now, you think that'd be enough? You think that when we experience or observe human suffering, for example, the human beings around us who are suffering, we'd notice it, and we'd immediately spring into action to alleviate that suffering if we could, or if not, to at least offer some comfort. And sometimes we do. Many of us were moved to donate money to the relief organizations following the tsunami in the Pacific or the earthquake in Haiti. And we didn't need the suffering of those victims explained or described to us in a parable. We got it. We got it just by watching it before our eyes on the evening news. But more often than not, I think we hear or see something on the evening news about some tragedy, some problem somewhere in the world, maybe in our own community, and we say to ourselves, isn't that a shame? And then we forget about it by the time we go to bed that night. Or we overhear a conversation where someone's saying something hateful or prejudiced or bigoted about a minority group, and aside from an internal thought or two about what a jackass that person is, we say and we do nothing, once more forgetting about it by the day's end. Or we witness a beautiful act of repentance and mercy, as did Simon in today's gospel. And instead of being moved to either repentance or mercy ourselves, we pick it apart in a critical way, find fault somewhere in it. I don't know why we do that, but we just do. And if God were like us, I think He'd probably just walk away in disgust. But He doesn't. He just gives us another shot at decency. And that's part two. Sometimes we fail to see and realize with our sensory experiences things that come clear to us later through either explicit or implicit stories that are constantly being told in our presence. And I think we've all been moved to compassion at times when we're watching a play or a movie or reading a novel about human suffering. Example, through her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe sensitized a nation that had been largely blind to the scourge of slavery. A little anecdote I found in doing some research: upon meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe, Abraham Lincoln, referring to the Civil War, is reported to have said, "So this is the little lady who made this big war." I think of myself as a compassionate person. I know that I'm a person who has a deep love for children. I know that many children suffer in this country and in this world. And I just heard a couple weeks ago a statistic of some news program about the increase in the number of children that are living in this country below the poverty level. Now I hear that and I feel bad for a moment, and then I forget about it. But God seems to give me a part two experience now and then that prods me into action. For example, I've seen in the newspaper on a number of occasions a solicitation for donations to an organization called the Smile Train. Anybody know about that? Okay. This organization sends medical teams around the world to do surgery on children who have cleft palates and other facial deformities. I can't ignore the picture of a deformed kid when I see that. When I know that I can, with a small amount of money, the amount of money I spend going out to dinner, I could do something to help. Those pictures in the newspaper, the solicitations that we get now at our house, serve the purpose of a parable because, as the saying goes, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So every now and then I write out, "Check the Smile Train." And you're not going to believe this. This is not a homily trick. I got this in the mail 2 days ago from Smile Train. You see the... You can't see it all, but I'll leave it up here. You can look at it later. Whole bunch of pictures of kids with facial deformities. Just breaks your heart. Get your attention, okay? But part three. Sad to say, we can still sometimes ignore reality when we experience it or see it in front of us in an implicit or an explicit story. Like I get these things probably, I don't know, every 3 or 4 months or so, and sometimes I throw them away, you know, with the other stack of stuff. And then sometimes I look at it. Sometimes I don't. Well, if God were like us, He'd he'd certainly walk away in sadness and disgust after giving us 2 shots of decency. And this is part 3. So thank God, literally thank God that he doesn't. Like Simon in the gospel story today, we sometimes have to have somebody or something connect the dots for us so that we can personalize what Jesus is trying to tell us, first through experience and then through stories. For example, Jesus says to Simon, he says, "Look here, my friend, you missed it when you failed to notice the act of repentance and my forgiveness when it occurred right before your eyes. And after I told you a story to help you get the picture, I still had to ask you in plain language if you understood the point I was trying to make. So I'm telling you again in plain language, as directly as I can, that your behavior toward me is the polar opposite of this woman whom you so readily condemn. I'm telling you that her sins are forgiven because she's shown such great love. And I'm telling you, it will be the same for you." Do you get it now? Well, I think God gives us part 3 experiences when something happens that makes us connect the dots and makes us personalize the truths he's trying to teach us through experience and stories. Think of the following questions. I think all of us at times have been asked by a friend, family member, somebody close to us, who's calling us to greater awareness or greater compassion. Phrases like, "How would you feel if someone said that to you? What would you do if that happened to your child? What if that were you? Would you be so disinterested in this if this was happening to one of your friends?" Or the giant killer. "Would you talk that way to your mother?" Or how can you simply remain silent when you see that going on? Now those questions said in the right way by the right person, motivated not by the desire to shame or to control, but by a desire to help us become the kind of person that we ought to be, can be part 3 experiences of this process that gets us moving, that produces actions that ought to be taken. Now, my initial reaction, to be honest, when challenged thus, is to be defensive and angry. But on those rare moments when I've had the grace to listen, I'm usually given the grace to respond. So do we listen to Jesus when he's trying to tell us a story? Well, sometimes we do when we're aware to the needs of those we encounter, when we experience calls to love, to justice, to peace. Sometimes we don't get it through experience, but we come to understand if we listen to stories that speak of love and justice and peace. And sometimes we just need to have somebody connect the dots for us, to personalize it, to call us to greater commitment to acts of peace, justice, and love. Seems to me Jesus will give us all the help that we need to help us understand, and it's up to us to make good use of what he offers us. He'll tell us through experience, he'll tell us through stories, and he'll tell us through those who connect the dots and personalize it for us. It's up to us to listen to his story in the many ways that he tells them.